One of the most significant accounting standards in terms of determining firm performance is revenue, and in particular when revenue is recognised. Now, the recognition of revenues might not seem to be a particular problematic issue, and that would be true when we have revenues are derived from the provision of only one good or service, when that good or service is subject to immediate delivery, and where payment is made immediately. In those circumstances, when to recognise revenue is, let's be perfectly honest, not very difficult. However, that's not always the case. And increasingly these days we see bundles of goods and services provided. Delivery might not be until some future date, and payment might be progressive, and there might be a significant financing component to the sale transaction. In those circumstances, then recognition of revenue is going to be a lot more problematic. And it was doubtless these factors that were a catalyst for the development of IFRS 15, revenue recognition, and in Australia that's repeated in AASB 15. The standard adopts a five-step process to the recognition of revenue, and it requires that you identify the contract, identify the performance obligations in the contract, determine the transaction price in the contract. You need to allocate the transaction price where you have different goods and services being provided, and you need to have some basis for determining when you recognise the revenue. So it's a five-stage process. So how does it start? Well, first of all, you need to identify the contract. The first issue that you need to understand is that a contract is an agreement between two or more parties that creates enforceable rights and obligations. So this contract must represent a commitment, and that contract can be written, oral, or customary. The contract should identify rights regarding goods or services. It should identify payment terms, and it should have a commercial substance to it. A practical issue is that you can't really recognise a transaction unless it's likely to be completed, and so it also says that collectability is important in terms of determining if there's a contract and revenue should be recognised. There are going to be a number of challenges in terms of identifying contracts for recognition of revenue. For example, sometimes you might have packages of contracts negotiated at the same time. Contracts negotiated a package. Maybe payments are conditional. Maybe they share a common performance obligation. In these circumstances, the standard requires, paragraph 17, that you regard the combination of contracts as a single contract and recognise the revenue in aggregate. Another complication is where contracts are subject to modification. And the issue is, do you treat the modification as a new or separate contract, or do you regard the contract modification as effectively terminating the old contract and restarting a new contract on the revised terms? The second step is to identify the performance obligations which are addressed in the contract. So what you need to identify is clearly the goods and services that have been promised, and you need to determine the performance obligations that need to be satisfied in meeting that performance obligation. These performance obligations might be satisfied at a point in time, or they might be satisfied over time. The next step is to determine the transaction price. This is the amount that the transaction is to be recognised at. And whilst this might normally seem to be a pretty straightforward process, it can be complicated. For example, there might be variable consideration, and likewise there might also be a significant financing component to the transaction where you have deferred consideration, and payments maybe not be required immediately and may be deferred or staggered over a 1 or 2 year period. In these circumstances, you need to recognise that money has a time value, and it's going to be a discounting of the revenues. Where you have multiple goods and services being provided in one contract, you need to have some basis for allocating the transaction price to each of the performance obligations. This should be done in the first instance on the basis of standalone prices. However, if there is a discount, this needs to be allocated across the separate goods and services. So you need to have some basis for allocating or spreading them. There also needs to be some basis for how we recognise changes in transaction prices. The final step is to work out when do you actually recognise the revenue. And you do this when you've achieved or satisfied the performance. Finally, there are the disclosure requirements. These disclosure requirements are quite extensive, and they relate to ensuring that you provide enough information to provide some certainty as to how revenues have been determined. It's going to require you to identify the contracts that you have with customers, the critical judgments that you're making, and any of your assets which are recognised as part of the contract negotiation process. Thank you.